Welcome to the Rise of the Moderates podcast, episode 4. On today's episode, I'm going to talk about infotainment and fake news, which I think is the single greatest threat facing America and our democracy today. Perhaps the greatest threat that's faced American democracy in our history, and I don't think that's overstating it. Now, it's hard for some people to see fake news and infotainment and the breakdown of our press and confidence in our press as a threat when traditionally when we think of threats, we think of foreign threats. And we certainly have those. Obviously, Russia and the recklessness of Vladimir Putin represents our most immediate current threat. Putin's a wild card. He's less predictable, I think, than any of the leaders of the Soviet Union were. He's a wild card, and I think that combined with another wild card, Donald Trump, a man who has proven that he's not analytical at all. He reacts on emotion, he reacts from gut, and he believes things that have no factual basis, as we have seen with his repeated claims that millions of people voted illegally in our elections when there's not a shred of evidence to support that. It's faith-based thinking, and it has no place in our politics, and certainly no place in the Oval Office. But he believes it. In his mind, it's true. And obviously no amount of evidence or lack thereof is going to convince him otherwise. Now, that kind of person, that mindset, combined with the unpredictability of a leader like Putin in Russia, this makes for a very dangerous situation and a very immediate threat right now. Now, long term, I think China represents a greater existential threat to the United States, a more long-term threat than Russia because, well, they're not going away. They'll be around for a while. Whereas Russia, it's more dependent on Putin. Once he goes, I think the Russian people will get their act together and hit the reset button on Russian democracy. And I think Russia can be reined in with economic sanctions and penalties if we had a president who felt that same way. Now, China's a different story. It seems we're so invested in China that we're completely unwilling to pressure China with sanctions and penalties when they are human rights abusers and are acting exceptionally aggressive in the South China Sea, which I think is probably the most dangerous region in the world today, or represents what could be the most dangerous region in the world today. So I think China represents our greatest existential threat in terms of a foreign power. ISIS, not an existential threat at all. It's a threat. They can do some damage here and there. It's a nuisance, but it is not an existential threat. And I know when I discuss this with conservative friends of mine, they get hung up on the word existential. It's a big word. Maybe they don't know what it means. I don't know. But they often come back saying, how can you say that ISIS isn't a threat? Well, that's not what I'm saying. They're a threat. They can kill some people. They're not an existential threat. They don't threaten our existence and our way of life. They don't have the power to do that. They can be a pain in our ass, yeah, but they are not an existential threat to the United States. But the greatest existential threat to the United States today is the rise of infotainment and fake news. The fourth estate, journalism, the free press. That's our most important institution. Now, as we've seen in Russia and other places around the world, you can have the vote, you can have legislature, a Senate or Congress, Parliament. We've seen that in other countries you can have a strong military, and none of that guarantees freedom. None of it. What did Putin do when he came in? He got rid of a free press. He made it state-controlled. End of story for Russian democracy. Game over. You have to have a free press. You have to have a vibrant, credible free press that people can trust, or at least trust-ish, in order to have a functioning democracy. Now today, the rise of 24-hour cable news and the rise of the internet, the institution of journalism is threatened in a way it has never been threatened before. It's crumbling. Its identity is jeopardized in a way it never has been before. And this is the lifeblood of our democracy. People don't understand that. Everybody hates the press. It is vilified for everything. It is blamed for everything. People talk about vast media conspiracies that the press is working to suppress this or boost that candidate. Now, of course, it's just people who don't understand journalism and the press at all. The press is the greatest guarantor of democracy, and without it, well, we're screwed. And nowadays, you have people who don't understand what is factual information and what isn't, and that's a dangerous, dangerous place to be. Now, back in the early 1980s, during the early days of cable television, you had the creation of 24-hour news channels, and then you had the creation of 24-hour music channels, MTV. Now, if you had asked Americans back then which one of those represented the greatest threat, which one of those represented the greatest threat to democracy and our way of life and our society and our culture, I'm sure that almost every single person would have said music television, 24-hour music television. Rock and roll, videos on TV all the time, just poisoning the minds of our youth. And what could possibly be bad about 24-hour news? You'd have a more informed electorate. People would be more informed about the issues. How could that possibly be bad? Well, it turns out that could not have been any farther from the truth. Now, of course, MTV, music televisions, and videos are completely inconsequential nowadays. And you have 24-hour news, which has perverted and distorted the news and the line between factual news and entertainment so much that we don't even know what is news anymore. We can't even seem to recognize it. There's pressure to constantly have viewers, because if you have a 24-hour news channel, you want viewers all the time. That's a lot different than back, let's say, from the 1960s through the 1980s, when people gathered around their TVs for half an hour each evening to watch one of the major networks' news broadcasts to get their news for the day, right after they'd sit down and read the paper. No, now these channels, they need ratings, they need viewers. And dry analysis, news, and bland informational news, it's not going to cut it. People want to be entertained. And a cold analysis of issues is not entertainment. People screaming and yelling, getting viewers emotionally charged and riled up. Now that's entertainment. Getting you upset about things and getting you to love things. That's entertainment. But using your brain, that is not entertainment. That's school. It's kind of work. It's a chore. Now, when you watch TV, you watch TV with your heart. You don't watch it with your brain. And 24-hour news executives, they know this. So what you have is 24 hours a day of people yelling, excuse me, and screaming on TV. Or you have these one-source discussions that are meant to emotionally charge their viewers, entertain them, but not necessarily inform. Now, facts aren't sexy. Facts don't get eyeballs. They don't get viewers. They don't get ratings. Emotionally connecting with people does. And so now we have an emotionally charged electorate, but an electorate that is completely uninformed. Now, on top of this, you also have had the rise of the internet, blogs. Now anyone can set up a news site. So you've had this narrative where conservatives, you see it on the left too, but conservatives have been vilifying the press for years. That they aren't fair to conservatives, that their coverage is slanted or skewed. Now, I've worked in journalism, and I know there may be some truth to that. When it comes to numbers, you may have more people in journalism who lean left than you do who lean right. But make no mistake, there are plenty of journalists who lean right. Plenty of newspapers and news organizations that lean right. I've worked with many of them. That was actually shocking to me when I first got into journalism, because I did expect that everybody would be far left leaning, because that's the perception from the outside. But there are plenty of people who are conservative who also get into journalism. So it certainly isn't the one-sided field that conservatives make it out to be. So with this narrative that they're not getting their way, that the press is unfair, and that there's some great conspiracy, let me first of all Journalism is like any other industry in our economy. It is a business. It is driven by profit. It is driven by the laws of supply and demand. There is no conspiracy. They're trying to make a buck. Anyway, so this narrative, excuse me, this narrative that conservatives don't get a fair shake, they've used the internet, blogs, and so-called news sites to create their own news now. To them, this solves the problem. They get conservative news out there. The problem is they're doing what they were afraid the left was doing all along. What they're doing is not news that is credible and factual. It is presented from one side. It's skewed. It's essentially propaganda and marketing. It's good guys and bad guys. It's not factually based, and it doesn't analyze issues. It's not credible journalism. It's propaganda. It's tainted, and it's presented only from the angle of conservatives, painting a picture of the world that they want you to see from their point of view, not necessarily based on credible facts. So you've had the rise of Breitbart and Red State and Infowars and all those loony websites and blogs. And then on the left, you've had the same thing with Occupy Democrats, Media Matters, and other ones doing the same thing. Just painting a picture of the news and the world from their narrow point of view. And the rise of social media, it's only made the problem worse, because if you identify with the left or if you identify with the right, well, you like these pages. They're news articles, so-called news articles. They show up in your news feed, and it just reinforces this position of yours that you like, that you're comfortable with, and you never end up questioning what you understand. You're never getting unbiased, relatively unbiased, factual, credible news. It's all slanted. And so now we have this country that is becoming increasingly polarized because of this. Meanwhile, you have regular news organizations. You have those half-hour network news shows and newspapers and organizations. They're still trying to present factual, credible news, only it's getting harder and harder for them. And as they lose viewers and ratings. And as I said, news is a business, just like any other. And both sides like to say that you can't trust the media, but then they're presenting heavily slanted, heavily misleading news themselves. I mean, I've had so many friends send me emails, and of course they share memes on Facebook and Twitter that they take as true, because they're coming from a source that they like, that tells them things that they like to hear, so they believe it to be true. The problem is that half of this stuff, well, probably more than half of it, it's factually incorrect. And it takes 3 minutes, just 3 minutes of research online to really come up with some evidence to prove that these things are completely false. But people don't want to put in the effort to do that. They just want to believe what they want to believe. I mean, I've had friends. I had one friend who saw online, he's a conservative friend of mine, and he saw online that, how did he put it? He said the Republicans were the ones who created Social Security, and the Democrats were the ones who had made it something that the government takes money out of. I was flabbergasted when I heard this, because it's completely factually incorrect. So I hopped online. It took less than a minute to come up with the details of the actual vote from the 1930s creating Social Security. It was a democratically controlled Congress, and we had a Democratic president, FDR, who signed it into law. And half of the Republicans in Congress voted for it. The Republicans split, I believe almost down the middle. I don't have the numbers in front of me, but I believe it was almost down the middle. So there were plenty of Republicans who backed it, but it was a Democrat program. But this take on it was just so factually incorrect, and it was just so ignorant of any knowledge of history. I was just shocked. So of course I presented him my evidence. It was strong evidence, and he just said, "Oh, I guess you're right." But do you think it stopped him from going to that website again or believing in conservative propaganda that he enjoys? Hell no. Didn't stop him for 1 second. It's just a blip on the radar. It was just, okay, that was wrong, and he moves on. And he will continue to cultivate and collect information that reinforces his previous beliefs. He just keeps going to those sources. When, I don't know about you, but I'd say, if this source is giving me false information and making me look like a fool, I don't know if I can trust this source of information. I'm going to get my information from a source that I can trust. And if this source is lying to me, I am not going to use that source anymore. But they don't do that. Now, this happens all the time. But it takes 2 seconds. I mean 2 seconds to prove most of this stuff is untrue. I mean, there was a meme going around that Donald Trump said in the late 90s that Republicans were stupid, and if he was to run, he'd run as a Republican because it would be so easy to win because they're so stupid. Now, of course, a liberal friend of mine shared it, but it took 2 seconds of research to see that there was no evidence that he had ever said this. Had no basis in fact. Now, I do not like Donald Trump, but I like facts. I want to deal in facts, and this was completely not based in facts. So, of course, I informed my liberal friend about this, and they corrected it or took it down. But do you think it stops this friend of mine from continuing to share memes without checking the validity of its claims? Of course not. I've had friends send me quotes from Hillary Clinton. There was one quote where she was talking about Benghazi. Now, if you're conservative or you have conservative friends, you probably know about this quote, where she said, "What does it matter?" And conservatives shared this quote. This quote was taken way out of context. A friend of mine sent it to me, and it sounded like she was saying, what does it matter about Benghazi and the people killed there? And it sounded so terrible and heartless the way it was presented. I thought, how could she say this? It was such a terrible thing to say. But it sounded so ridiculous. It just didn't pass the smell test. So again, maybe 3 minutes online, you can get the actual dialogue, the actual transcript of the hearing in which she said this. And Breitbart and conservative websites took it completely out of context and misrepresented it. You can't read it and not agree with her. She was not talking about the deaths in Benghazi. Look it up. There's no way you can read the full transcript of that and not agree with her take. Anyways, so you have these sites. So my conservative friends, my liberal friends, despite the fact that they are proven to be sharing information that is factually incorrect again and again, they still go back to these sources. Now why? How can they not wrap their minds around the fact that maybe you're being misinformed and misled? Maybe people are just sheep. I mean, they want to identify with a team, I guess, with a brand. And are they going to be loyal to that no matter what? I mean, that's a dangerous, dangerous thing, because we need an informed electorate. We need people who care about the country more than they care about their team or their brand or their politics. We need to be able to have political discussions in this country that are based on fact. And there's a lot of websites and people out there who try to distort facts, and say that facts are all relative. That maybe there are no such thing as just facts, and that everything is just perception. I mean, that's bogus. Look, it comes down to evidence. If there's evidence and data suggesting one thing or another, it's like a court of law. You have to go with the strongest evidence. That's pretty close to fact. At some point, you have to take things as fact when there is overwhelming evidence one way and not a lot of evidence another. You can't just believe things. I mean, these people are like some of the jurors on the OJ jury who perhaps wanted OJ to get away with it or wanted to believe that OJ was innocent. So despite being presented with these mountains of scientific evidence suggesting that OJ did it, they were willing to ignore that overwhelming evidence and just cling to the sliver of hope when the glove didn't fit. So they're just cherry picking their evidence. It it drives me crazy. Now, there was one article I recently read on how you are not entitled to your opinion, and I'll share that online. But made the case that your opinion needs to be informed, and it needs to be open to being challenged. Now, we need an informed electorate. We need people who can discuss and debate facts. There's plenty of debate. Should government be doing this? Should it not be doing that? I mean, there is plenty that is worth debating. How is government overreaching here? Is it not doing enough? There are plenty of philosophical debates that we can have based on fact and based on our interpretation of government and when it should be doing something and when it shouldn't, and its role in our lives. But things are so skewed right now. Things are so skewed. And when we can't even discuss facts, when we can't even agree on what the facts are, we have a problem. We have a big problem. There's a big problem in how we get our news and information. Now, if you don't trust the so-called mainstream media, man, we've got big problems, because that mainstream media, that's the lifeblood of our country. That is the backbone of our society. That is what is holding our system together. So we have way too many Americans who are rejecting this media and going to their blogs and their niche websites, and basically, instead of getting news and facts from credible sources, they're getting propaganda and marketing, and that is a dangerous place to be. Now, you may not fully trust the mainstream media, so you know what you need to do. You need to get your news. You need to get your news from multiple sources. But we need to get away from the 24-hour news cycle and our niche websites and fake news websites. Maybe go back to those half-an-hour news programs and our newspapers. And if you don't trust one newspaper, read a couple of them. If you don't trust one news program, watch a couple of them. If you don't trust things when they are telling you something, question it. Question whether or not that is actually true. Question whether it is good information. What is the evidence? What is the data supporting that? Question that. Even when somebody tells you something you like, question it. Is it true? That is the question you need to be asking yourself. So get your news from multiple sources, but try to get it from a credible news source, not a source that is going to caress your ego or tell you what you want to hear. Of course, then it gets down to what is news and what is fake news, because it seemed pretty obvious to me. But then the other day, I had a friend of mine who lives in Texas. He's been to Afghanistan. He's a member of our military. Great guy, nice guy, but man, way conservative and a complete conspiracy theorist. And in a group email to me and a bunch of other guys the other day, he warned a friend of mine who's pretty moderate about fake news sites. Now, this shocked me, because if there's anybody who seems to be getting his news from fake news sites, it's this guy. And he seems so out there. But he seems to think his news sites are real news sites and that the mainstream media is fake news. How are we going to solve things when we can't even agree on what is real news and what is fake news? If we can't figure this out, if our electorate keeps getting less informed with distorted information instead of becoming more informed with factual information, we're screwed. We are completely screwed, because this is what holds our nation together. Information, the discussion of information. So this infotainment, this fake news, this is the greatest threat facing our democracy. As George Washington said in his farewell address, he said it was essential that the public opinion be enlightened. And it is. In a democracy, public opinion must be enlightened. Now, infotainment, fake news, there's no clear-cut solution here. Which makes it incredibly frightening. We can't just legislate it away because this is a free country, and we can't start putting too many rules on news organizations, even if they are like Breitbart, a glorified blog that takes things out of context and distorts and lies. So what are we going to do? We need a smarter electorate. We need smarter people. We need an electorate that knows how to think critically, that reads something and then says, or hears something and then says, well, show me the evidence. And then, where did this evidence come from? Who is providing it? Are they credible? Or is this a made-up source or committee? Because there are so many of them with America-friendly names. I mean, you have the oil industry running ads from groups with environmentally friendly names, usually narrated by a woman's voice to make you think of a mother with her children. And the coal industry. Look, just because the packaging is nice doesn't mean what's in the box is good or even something you want. So even if it's a pleasant sounding woman who is narrating a message about how wonderful coal is, and it's from a group that calls itself Businesses for a Brighter American Future or a Cleaner American Future, it doesn't. That's just packaging. It could still. You have to look deeper than that. What is really going on? Because there is so much marketing. That's what politics is now. It's marketing, just like how food companies market junk food to you, and you end up believing it's healthy when it's not even real food. Special interest, coal, oil, all these other, they all do the same thing. So we need to look deeper. We need to think more critically. How do we do that? That's the question. Because how do we get our friends and our neighbors to think critically? Because you can't legislate this away. And with social media, they're just an echo chamber. We're increasingly living in these newsfeed bubbles where we only get info from sources we like instead of information that we need. And we are becoming more and more misinformed. And it's destroying our political